would like to introduce Ronan Peck, who has been with PPS for quite some time. She has finished her degree at PSU and is now here to talk about what she's learned at the end of that journey and Indigenous people and the Western paradigm. Take it away, Ronan.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the second installment of my series on Indigenous knowledge and the psychedelic renaissance. Today's topic is on the modern Western understanding of psychedelics. But just in case you weren't here last time, or if you'd just like to refresh your memory, let's quickly recap last month's discussion. This is also so we can more clearly see the connection between the two topics. So last month we talked about the ancient history of entheogens being any psychoactive plant that is used for spiritual or religious purpose. And specifically, we learned about the indigenous groups that have utilized these entheogens for thousands of years. Sadly, a very prevalent theme throughout this history was Western invaders coming to conquer these lands and typically demonizing entheogenic practices and doing their best to wipe out these practices entirely in order to convert the indigenous peoples over to Catholicism or Christianity. For a significant amount of history, Western invaders did their best to squash the use of any non-alcoholic-based intoxicant. Throughout last month's presentation, I attempted to highlight the irony that I see here. Despite the Western world's historically negative view on psychedelics, and despite what colonizers have done to indigenous psychedelic practices, the Western world is now the group leading the charge when it comes to revitalizing interest in the healing potential of psychedelics. This is starting to take the shape in form of psychedelic science, the scientific method, of course, being a Western invention. Now, let me make something very clear. I'm not against science, nor am I against Western inventions. I am, in fact, very much for both of these things, as long as there are checks and balances in place to ensure good inventions aren't used to suppress the rights of others. But let me paint a scene for y'all. Indigenous folks in the Americas used psychedelics for thousands of years and had great personal and spiritual purpose for them. Western invaders come to conquer them in their land, and psychedelic use is either squashed for good or driven underground. This continues for the next couple of centuries, from the 1500s into the late 1900s. There is some retaliation, as we see with peyote and the creation of the Native American Church, but no major law changes until much, much later. Then, starting around the 1940s, a whisper of great scientific intrigue around psychedelics starts bubbling up in Europe. Various intelligent minds are starting to see the potential significance in humanity's psychedelics. This great scientific intrigue starts to build traction, and before long, word of the potential of the healing power of psychedelics reaches the United States, thanks in part to Albert Hofmann's discovery of lysergic acid diethylamide, otherwise known as LSD. There was a decade or so of research done and much experimentation among the masses when psychedelic research was shut down yet again by the US government thanks to Nixon's war on drugs and the subsequent reign of Reaganism. This continued on all throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s until finally in the later years of the 90s and the early 2000s, we see scientific intrigue in psychedelics start to boom again. And at this time, we find some really amazing stuff. Scientific evidence that psychedelic use can help anxiety, depression, PTSD, and more. These are amazing findings, right? Of course they are. But for now, for a second, imagine being a part of an indigenous group that has already collectively understood and known about the potentials of psychedelics for thousands of years. The ancestors of the same group that long ago told your ancestors that they weren't allowed to use psychedelics are now the ones bringing all the attention to the healing elements that your group has known about since the beginning of humanity. Again, I'm not against psychedelic science. The rest of this presentation is going to be me singing its praises. I just believe that the scientific world needs to be much more aware of this history and to somehow bring indigenous voice into the conversation. Remember that both perspectives are just as important as the other. The aim here is for these groups and ideologies to benefit from and work well with one another. But that cannot happen until both groups are considered by the government. So how did scientific intrigue first gain a foothold in the United States and the Western world overall? An appropriate place to start when considering the scientific history of psychedelics, mainly due to the historical significance and popularity of this event, is the discovery of an important chemical compound, one that would change the life of its discoverer and many people after him, and of course being Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD. As stated in Hofmann's 1996 speech, LSD Completely Personal, The initial synthesis happened on November 16, 1938. Hoffman was experimenting with ergot alkaloids in order to obtain a novel, improved circulatory stimulant. At first, he was unsure of its efficacy for much of anything, and he left the chemical synthesis alone for the next 5 years, until one day he had the urge to experiment with the substance again. He recounts that his first exposure was accidental, and so on April 19, 1943, he purposely dosed himself and went on what he described as a horror trip. While that sounds unpleasant at best, that didn't stop him from realizing LSD's potential and continuing to study the chemical. And of course, April 19th is now affectionately known for many who partake as Bicycle Day, in reference to Hoffman's ride home while under the influence. He later describes his horror trips as frightening at points, but also enlightening. This leads to the modern idea that there is no such thing as a bad trip, but rather challenging trips that can be learned from. In fact, Michael Pollan, a modern and quite popular psychedelic researcher and writer, and Bridget Huber, his research assistant, write about their findings of a Johns Hopkins survey taken on the challenging experiences people had under the influence of psilocybin. Interestingly enough, despite these negative experiences, many of the survey respondents still found even those bad trips to be meaningful and spiritually important. For 34% of participants, their most challenging trip on psilocybin was ranked among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life. And 31% said that it was among the top 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their life. 84% of the respondents said that they had benefited from the challenging parts of their trip, and 46% said that they would repeat that session if they could, despite the challenges. So, being that Albert Hoffman was a Swiss scientist, how did LSD make its way over to the United States? Well, to start, the Swiss laboratory that held its discovery was intrigued by LSD's possible usefulness, and thus became a commercially available medication under the name Delsid for a variety of different psychiatric uses in 1947, following the 1943 patent of the substance. Then in 1949, the same laboratory that assigned the patent in Switzerland brought the U.S. government to the attention of LSD, citing possible usefulness in clinical applications, that laboratory being Sandoz Laboratories. This introduction launched a decades-long battle for and against LSD on all sides, that being civilian, government, and scientific. Time magazine even published 6 separate reports about the positive benefits of LSD from 1954 to 1959. So there's a sizable amount of LSD history contained within the decades of 1950 and the 1960s, and so I will do my best to keep the information concise. Essentially, throughout the 1950s, there were a growing number of researchers looking at the possible uses of LSD, starting with the method of producing model psychosis, through which mental illness could be studied. This is very indicative of the approach towards psychology at the time, which was primarily focused on the illness side of mental illness. An important name throughout all this is Sidney Cohen, a leading research authority on LSD in the 1950s. After having taken the substance for the first time on October 12, 1955, he recounts his experience as being surprisingly positive, considering the current mental illness rhetoric that was being pushed by fellow researchers at the time, as we can see here. Cohen expected to feel catatonic or paranoid, but instead he wrote, "I was taken by surprise. This was no confused, disoriented delirium, but something quite different." His subsequent report described feeling an elevated peacefulness, as if the problems and strivings, the worries and frustrations of everyday life vanished. In their place was a majestic, sunlit, heavenly inner quietude. It seemed to have finally arrived at the contemplation of eternal truth. After this personal discovery, he teamed up with another important name in psychedelic history, that being Aldous Huxley. Together with Betty Eisner, the team explored whether or not LSD could be helpful to facilitate psychotherapy, address alcoholism, and enhance creativity. Studies continued on into the 60s and even the mid-70s as LSD grew in popularity, both among the masses and among academic researchers. This includes Richard Alpert, better known as Ram Dass, who was also experimented on using LSD during MKUltra, and Timothy Leary, a psychology professor at Harvard, who is known for his activism in making LSD publicly known and revered among counterculture groups at the time. The two worked together to perform dubious scientific research at Harvard, dubious by today's standards at least. until they were both kicked from the school altogether, fueling Leary's activism. This advocacy, however, may have backfired, as even Albert Hoffman states in his book LSD, My Problem Child. The evolution of LSD from remedy to inebriating drug was, however, primarily promoted by the activities of Dr. Timothy Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert of Harvard University. This brings me to an important aside. These substances are powerful and cannot and should not be taken or given out with negligence. With great power comes great responsibility, and I'm afraid that, at least in their years of research, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert did not necessarily do their due diligence to keep people safe and to keep their research sane. According to Hoffman's first-hand account of his 1970 meetings with Dr. Leary, the LSD apostle, as he was known at the time, had slipped away from pure scientific method and into his own experimentations, hosting LSD parties that were far removed from their original scientific purpose. Hoffman describes him as a very passionate person who was very sure of his mission, so much so that he may have lost sight or frequently overlooked the potential downfalls or risks to psychedelic therapy. This is part of the reason we must move forward into further psychedelic research with the utmost care and consideration. Thankfully, now, because of institutional review boards, otherwise known as RIBs, which engage community members to help evaluate research proposals before approval and also require informed consent, research is done much more ethically today. Another important point that I'd like to quickly make here is that the government tends to take scientific and scientific discovery more seriously than what Indigenous folks have to say. How can the psychedelic science community uplift and ensure that these important voices are being heard? Keep this in your mind as you listen to the rest of this presentation so we can brainstorm together at the end. So a large section of the history of psychedelics in the United States is related to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and the war on drugs that was launched at the end of the 1960s. This is an utterly expansive topic, one that relates heavily to the sociology of drug use in the state. As such, this topic deserves its own presentation, and for now, all I will say is that the war on drugs set back psychedelic science and discovery and left a lasting scar on the general collective view on drugs, which is problematic for many reasons. It's also heavily implicated in the phenomenon of structural racism, the war on drugs being a major example of this phenomenon. As such, next month's topic, as well as January's topic, is going to be about the history of the war on drugs and structural racism. So if you're interested in learning more, make sure you mark it in your calendars. The dates are on the screen. So now that we have a decent understanding of where the United States stands with psychedelics in the modern era, let's start to dive into some major discoveries that we've made. This is some really, really exciting stuff. I do apologize, it gets a bit jargony, so I'm going to do my best to talk slowly and clearly. If anybody wants me to re-explain a concept in simpler terms, just ask at the end of the presentation or put it in the chat and I'll grab it. I will also be providing a Google Doc link, which will contain a link to my paper, as well as a list of links to the papers I specifically referenced in this presentation. So there's great scientific evidence that points to psychedelics' efficacy in treating depression, anxiety, drug use disorders, and more. In order to understand how psychedelics could possibly benefit someone suffering from symptoms of these disorders, we must first begin to understand why we have these symptoms in the first place. Naturally, these mental ailments are incredibly complicated, and so for the purpose of this presentation, we shall be focusing on a very specific function of the brain in order to keep it concise. This function and the network of brain regions involved is known as the default mode network, hereby referred to as the DMN. Essentially, the DMN is a collection of areas within the cerebral cortex that are responsible for resting state activity within the brain. Essentially, whenever you are not focused on an attention-demanding, goal-directed task, i.e., you're in a resting brain state and the default mode network is active. This active resting state is responsible for self-referential processing and mind-wandering. This refers to both self-evaluation as well as perceived evaluation from others, otherwise known as social evaluation. To give an example, if you've ever wondered why you cannot seem to shut your brain off at 2 a.m., wanting to sleep, but instead thinking about that one time in 8th grade where that embarrassing thing happened to you, you can thank your default mode network for that. So as we can see, this can clearly be an active resting state of the brain. So there is evidence that sufferers of depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders all have altered default mode network functionality, meaning that the DMN ailments, but it has been shown that all three alter the resting state activities of the brain. In depression, it has been shown that sufferers fail to normally downregulate DMN activity, as well as having heightened responses to stimulus-induced negativity. This means that these individuals are more receptive to negative evaluations of their world and have a harder time shutting down those evaluations. As for anxiety, the results are fairly similar. For both depression and anxiety, the same areas and functions have shown to be altered. Specifically, the functional connectivity within the anterior portions of the DMN, which are related to self-referential and emotional processes, were found to be positively correlated with those suffering from anxiety and depression. However, the posterior areas related to episodic memory and perceptual processing were found to be negatively correlated. In more simplified terms, individuals suffering from depression and anxiety are spending more time thinking about and ruminating on social evaluations and emotions, and have a harder time perceiving and remembering events correctly. This means that the perceptions of the world are altered and are generally more negative than they need to be. And as we know, your perception is your world. So substance use disorders, otherwise known as addiction, could be related to a dysfunctional default mode network as well. It has been shown that the default mode network is, again, not functioning as it should, and this dysfunction is specifically associated with cravings and relapse. Specifically, the resting functional connectivity of the anterior DMN, which, as we learned before, is responsible for self-referential and emotional processes, decreases, which leads to poor emotional regulation, which leads to relapse, and leads to less care towards the self, allowing one to give in to cravings without thinking of the negative consequences that that action may have on the self. On top of that, the default mode network as a whole is overly active during withdrawal and during that resting state, leading addicted individuals to ruminate, which is to think obsessively, about taking the substances they are currently withdrawing from. We also see disrupted connectivity between the default mode network and cortical regions that deal with executive functioning and memory, making it difficult for the addicted individual to fully perceive and understand the effects their substance use disorder is having on them and their life. All of this together leaves these individuals in a battle against their own brain and chemistry. So now that we know the role that the default mode network plays in these three afflictions, we can start looking into methods that help reduce the dysfunction in the default mode network. Interestingly, both the influence of psychedelics on the brain, as well as meditation and other mindfulness techniques, can have positive therapeutic results in treating mood disorders, even for treatment-resistant individuals. First, let's focus on psychedelics. According to a 2018 literature review published on the effects of psychedelics, those being psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, and ayahuasca, their effects on the default mode network, there are significant alterations within the function of the default mode network that may mark the efficacy of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Essentially, psychedelics greatly affect the default mode network, and they affect it in ways that are very beneficial to individuals who struggle with a dysfunctional or overactive default mode network. Fascinatingly, the default mode network has been shown to function in the exact opposite way that it does in mood disorders when sufferers are under the influence of psychedelics. So in jargony terms, the default mode network is found to have an increased activity of main nodes, as well as abnormal functional connectivity when afflicted by mood disorders. Under the influence of psychedelics, however, the default mode network activity is leveled, and positive coupling between the main nodes is reduced. This points to psychedelics' effectiveness in combating mood disorders related to the default mode network. So in non-jargony terms, this means that the default mode network is both overactive and dysfunctional when under the duress of a mood disorder. This dysfunction leads to overthinking and overanalyzing of the self and social interaction, and typically involves negative overall evaluations, leaving a person to feel stuck in their negative perception. And as we know, your perception is your reality, and this is why psychedelics can be so effective for combating mental illnesses. They can bring you new and novel perspectives, and when done properly, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy can even bring treatment-resistant individuals out of depression. So a study conducted in 2016 by Carter Harris at the Imperial College London has shown that an amazing 67% of participants with treatment-resistant depression had significantly reduced depression symptoms 1 week, with 40% of participants showing a sustained response at 3 months post-dose. This is a very important finding considering that treatment-resistant depression is just that, treatment-resistant. From my own experience talking with people experiencing treatment-resistant depression, it can be outright debilitating. So these findings are hugely significant for this population. In fact, and as most of us know, the FDA granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy status in 2018, and in 2019 and 2028, respectively, Colorado and Oregon decriminalized the possession of psilocybin. So once rules are established, permit holders can conduct psilocybin-assisted therapy within specific centers of healing, which is obviously really exciting. So slowly but surely, the Western world, driven by ethically bound science, is catching on to the knowledge that Indigenous people have understood for thousands of years. Another ancient knowledge that is being rediscovered within the context of healing mood disorders, such as depression and anxiety, are meditation and mindfulness techniques. Interestingly, mindfulness evokes similar changes in the brain as psychedelics, specifically within the functionality of the default mode network. So since we can already start to look at specific default or dysfunctions of the DMN as a biomarker for diagnoses of certain mental illnesses, we can also start to look at changes within that functionality during the course of treatment as a biomarker for the efficacy of that treatment. Essentially, dysfunction within the cortical region of the brain tells us that certain mental illnesses are at play. Using this information, we can then understand which therapies are working just by looking at how an individual's default mode network is functioning while participating in treatment. Do mindfulness and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy assist proper functionality of the default mode network? There's scientific evidence that, yes, they do. This was shown to be accurate with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, although more research is certainly required in order to make any conclusive statements. Specifically for the case of meditation, modulation of the default mode network is the highest predictor of efficacy for said treatment. In other words, the practice of meditation helps a person suffering from rumination quell their overactive thought processes through gaining a better control over said thought processes. So researchers have been looking into ways to combine psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and mindfulness techniques, considering the potential that both treatments have, as well as the similarities between how they function within the brain. This research is quite new and as such must be tested, as we can see in the 2019 study looking at psilocybin-assisted mindfulness training. They set up a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind study in which 38 participants were given a single dose of psilocybin before a 5-day mindfulness retreat. As an aside, an interesting phenomenon about psychedelics is they tend to provide long-lasting benefits, and so one dose over the span of 5 days can certainly be enough to maintain effect. The researchers started with an fMRI to gain a base level of the understanding of default mode network functionality within the participants, and then scanned them again during the resting state activity, as well as during 2 forms of mindfulness training. It was found that the psilocybin had a synergistic effect with the mindfulness therapy session, specifically the regions of the default mode network that mediate a sense of self, that's really interesting, were found to be decoupled during the psilocybin-assisted mindfulness session. Those regions being the medial, prefrontal, and posterior cingulate cortices, areas with which both psilocybin and meditation affect. This decoupling from both the psilocybin and the meditation is associated with a subjective ego dissolution effect, which in turn predicted positive changes in psychosocial functioning of participants 4 months later. So as it turns out, the common psychedelic moniker of ego death can indeed be tracked in the brain, on top of being able to physically track the positive effects that an experience of an ego death might have. In fact, the default mode network might be a primary role in what we know as the ego. Therefore, practices such as psychedelic psychotherapy and meditation may bring on the experience of ego dissolution. And this ego dissolution is exactly why these practices are helpful. It grants us the ability to step outside of oneself and take on different perspectives that were previously unknown and unrealized. The study implies that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and perhaps especially when used in conjunction with mindfulness techniques such as meditation, medication that could provide individuals suffering with depression and anxiety lasting relief, although more studies must be done in order to truly make any conclusive statements. So let's recap. Last month, we talked about the ancient indigenous history of the use of entheogens in order to gain a solid understanding of how long these substances have been important to people. We then talked about the history behind the colonization of indigenous groups by the Western world, which subsequently drove psychedelic use underground. During this presentation, we discussed the Western world's own discovery of psychedelics, starting in the 1900s and moving into the present day, specifically in America, which went from the first psychedelic boom to the war on drugs, and then to the modern day psychedelic renaissance. So considering that indigenous folks and knowledge are still largely undermined and overlooked by the scientific community, let's now brainstorm some ways in which we can converge the two. The first step, of course, is education. It is the individual's job to hit the books and gain a deeper understanding of who lived and died here on this land before them, and what psychedelics meant to each group who used them. From there, an individual can then inform others around them by encouraging others to do the same, or perhaps creating volunteer outreach groups to spread awareness. Volunteering your time and money towards indigenous communities are one of the absolute best ways to help them. These are all especially helpful if you're a part of the psychedelic science community, where you might be able to pull more strings than the average person. And that was it. Thank you, everybody. I would really like to have part of the discussion at least being kind of like a way to, or like if people have different ideas of how we can more like seamlessly converge indigenous knowledge and scientific discovery, that would be awesome.
I find the concept of a double-blind study with psychedelics intriguing. How do you do that? I mean, for anyone who has ever done psychedelics, you can't give me a placebo and tell me I'm going to know it's a placebo. Nothing's happening. So how do they do that? How do they square that round hole?
Right, exactly. So from my understanding, it is like, I think they generally try to go for people who like haven't used psychedelics before, so that they like don't really have an idea of like what that would be like. And like of course you can lie and be like, oh, I haven't used them before, and then like know that you got the placebo, which would probably change things. But yeah, I mean, generally it's kind of a hard thing to study because yeah, look at the effects from the psychedelics and the effects from the placebo, and it's just so entirely different. But I mean, still something that we kind of have to do. We haven't figured out anything better. Yeah, I don't have any like exact answers for you, but that's my general understanding.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I wonder whether this is not that important a point, but it may not be that they use a placebo for the control group. The control group is just that group that has some of the same conditions, but don't receive the psychedelic, and then they compare the results over time, I would guess.
Yeah, I would say so. In this study, they did have a placebo, but yes, they are definitely like looking at the same sort of like, okay, this person has really bad treatment-resistant depression, so does this person. How does psychedelics affect this person? How is this person continuing to live their life? David, you have a question?
I do, yeah. Thanks very much for putting this on. I appreciate it. So I was not privy to the conversation firsthand that I'm going to refer to, but one of the people involved in one of the studies at one of the large universities had made a comment that leading to the expectation that a single dose experience of this is supposed to treat somebody indefinitely. Again, I was not privy to this conversation, so I don't want to give the impression that that's accurate. It could have been potentially somebody who is in a death stage, pre-death, dealing with that, with a terminal disease. One would help. But have you heard that comment at all, and do you have any response to that?
Yeah, so that is kind of one of the beautiful things about psychedelic therapy, is that through other therapies, other medication-based therapies, where they expect you to take this thing like every single day, possibly for the rest of your life, psychedelics are kind of supposed to be this, if not like one time, then like maybe like once a month, once a year type of experiences they're very, very long lasting, both within the brain and within the psychology of the person. However, I don't think that just one dose, one time is going to last a person forever. But I think people kind of hear this like oh, like it's really, really potent and it's going to last a long time, and think that that would just be like one dose, you're good, you're done. And like that might be the case for certain people. There might be someone with like really low grade depression, really low grade anxiety, where they have this really big, insane trip and they decide, well, I don't need to do that ever again because, you know, I learned what I needed to learn from it and I can move on. It just really depends on the person. But I think that's kind of where that comes from.
I'm still trying to get in touch with the person who supposedly said that and kind of pick their brain, because I'm so curious based on personal experience. And I think when you're dealing with treatment-resistant depression, and especially due to complex trauma, it just seems like there's so much, especially from childhood for a lot of people, that my experience is part of the whole psychedelic use is really accessing and digging out a lot of stuff. And that'd be one hell of an experience if it all happened at once. And I'm in no way discounting the validity of the psychedelics as treatment, because I personally know, 40 years of being on medications, it's basically just maintenance. It's not a cure. I heard somebody say it's not a happy pill. It's just not a miserable pill. And we have no idea of some of the damage that's done, and we have a really good idea of a lot of the other damage that it's done.
So one of the things is like psychedelics, as you're talking about, it's not a pill that you take, that the mechanism of the chemical is the healing, that there's an active component in a different way. And not that I think there's a way in which we could relate to most pharmaceutical psychiatry from that same place. You don't just take an antidepressant, you take an antidepressant and you go to therapy and you start eating different and you start, improving your sleep and you start working on all of the regulatory aspects of your body and your community. And, it does feel like one of the hopes for me around the use of psychedelic treatment is that we recognize that from the beginning, that it's a little bit more baked in, that this is not a treatment that can come just simply consume the substance. And I think that is coming, trying to bring it back into how do we integrate is like, that's potentially where the indigenous wisdom and knowledge lies, is they never use these substances as some sort of like, you just take it and then you're done. It's like you take it and you work it and you live it. The scientific method is largely observation and an attempt to connect cause and effect, and a recognition that when systems are too complicated, you need to simplify it as much as you can so that you can have more of a direct relationship between cause and effect, right? I mean, that is not any different than what people have been doing throughout all of human history. Observation, cause and effect, trial runs, like experimentation is just what we do. However, the scientific method seems to be the place in which humans decided it was actually possible to simplify things, that you can externalize certain variables and just act like they don't exist. So that for me brings in the whole thing of like the way in which we understand what health is has been reduced in a certain way.
So I wanted to say that one of the things that I feel like we can glean from the indigenous use of psychedelics and that history, and that getting back to like our instincts and not having to understand everything. The whole scientific realm is like, we have to understand it all. We have to know what's going on. Well, how about we like pay attention to what's going on in our bodies, and that we're so disconnected from that as a society. And so I think that's where a lot of the scientific stuff gets wrapped up in. And I mean, I'm not saying that all of the people that are doing the research are not acknowledging that, but I think a lot of people just the attachments to having to know why something is happening and needing science to prove it is taking away from our ability to get back into our own bodies and to that. I mean, that's how the indigenous people did it. That's what they did. They didn't have textbooks or scientists or Bunsen burners, or they didn't have that. They didn't have scientific experiments. And so anyway, I think that that's what we can get back to with learning from the indigenous. Is I think that's where a lot of the underground practice for psychedelic work is more focused, because it is just like intuition and yeah.
The scientific method, the whole process is about deconstruction, controlling variables, dissection, really, taking pieces and pulling them apart. And it really is what informs us as Westerners. And mean, the whole separation, I mean, it's come so far from the Renaissance to now. That separation has been continuing and going great, becoming greater and greater. And we now see it within this internal diaspora, within families. There's no internal connection with people. And looking at indigenous societies and working with psychedelics and the medicines that are all around them, interdependence is completely built in. Everybody is dependent on everybody else. And a journey, if someone is going to take a psychedelic journey with the aid of other people in their community, it begins long before the actual journey occurs and continues on long after the journey itself. The journey is sort of milepost, I guess. I'm losing my train of thought here. It's a milepost on the journey, but it is not the focus of the journey at all. It is a facilitator of stages of what you're going through in the journey. Something that I think is important that we need to remember as people who are exploring this and trying to get back to our reconnection and rebuilding community. We can't look to the indigenous populations that we have destroyed to teach us what it is to have those connections. We have to find those ourselves. We're sort of on our own. We have models, but depending on the indigenous communities to tell us how to do it is just another form of exploitation, as far as I'm concerned. Many of you know Stan Groff, and he was one of the folks who did an awful lot of the research in the 50s and 60s, basically started the transpersonal psychology movement, if you want to call it that, and did amazing work. He's got a whole library of books that he's written himself, and two of them during that period of time were on death and dying and the psychedelic experience, and did a lot of work with terminal cancer patients and schizophrenics very successfully, and was very frustrated with Timothy Leary. That's all I can say.
Indigenous people are successful in their exercises at community building over and over for thousands of years. And we Westerners have been really successful at destroying our communities and creating whole new ones and moving them real fast. And I feel like we're living now in this time of such shredded social fabric, and in a time of collapse and a time of plague and everything. And as somebody who survived the last plague, I think about what I was doing 35 years ago to survive. And one of the things I did was I found my community of the Radical Fairies. And one of the things that held us together when literally people were dying all around us, like literally dying, and no one cared, and they thought we deserved it. We got together in heart circles at gatherings, and a heart circle is a really simple ritual. It's really basic, and I think Indigenous people have been sitting in circles and speaking from the heart and listening from the heart since forever. And that's what keeps them together. And so for 30 years, I've been going to Radical Fairy gatherings and speaking from the heart, listening from the heart in these intentional containers where we don't just sit there and say, oh, okay, we're here. We have a little ritual. We breathe together, little simple things, deep breaths, call the 4 directions. Hey, you're here. We got a container. We got some ground rules, and let her rip. And suddenly, everyone's bearing their soul. And I've been recently applying that technology towards medicine magic and dosing discussions. And we've been doing it on Zoom, but we just had our second meeting last night where 10 people from Southern California to Canada got together on Zoom for 2 hours, and we created a container and we checked in about the medicines we were using. And for some people it was psychedelics, for some people it was antidepressants or sugar or meth or whatever. And we're people that we don't like to go to 12-step meetings because there's too many steps and too much dogma. We just needed the container. And so the clinicalization of mushrooms is going to happen whether we like it or not. And the pharmaceuticalization of all these substances is gonna happen whether we like it or not. I just feel like it's really important that as those things are happening, we don't give up, and that we create our own community-based rituals that stand alone, where we teach each other how to grow, we teach each other how to sit in a circle, and we teach each other how to sit with one another while we're tripping and be trip sitters for one another. We don't need to go to Mexico to study how to sit with somebody while they're tripping on mushrooms. I mean, my people have been doing it for a while, and we've figured it out, and we're created our own rituals. And so I think one of the lessons of the Indigenous people is like, we figured it out for ourselves. You can watch us, you can ask us questions, but we need them to do it for us. We can do this. We're grown-ups, and we're also, I believe we need to make apes great again. Create your little rituals. It doesn't have to be quantum physics and 12 hours of chanting. It could be like 3 deep breaths and holding hands.
The circle will bring us together.
Stan Grof arrived at Esalen back in the early 70s, and Dick Price, who was the co-founder of Esalen, was doing what I think he was calling Gestalt therapy, but it was really the beginning of holotropic breath work that he and Stan developed together. Dick never got credit for that and ended up dying when he was on a hike down in Big Sur. A rock fell down and hit him on the head. But his work was really the foundation of Stan's work, because when Stan arrived, he had just had experience with LSD. And I don't know if you know the story of when Stan was in Czechoslovakia, I guess it was, as a graduate student, and arrived in the mail a box from Sandoz with a note saying, we're not sure what this stuff is, but it seems kind of powerful and may give insight into psychosis. And so that's how Stan got into working with LSD, came to Esalen only with the basis of LSD experience. And Dick was doing this work that was the incipient beginnings of holotropic breath work, and then it went from there. So I just mentioned that for the sake of history. Dick was a wonderful man, and somebody who, interestingly, had come from an experience of deep psychosis and had been committed to an institution by his parents back east and was subjected to electroconvulsive therapy. And it was that whole experience that helped him realize that deep psychological experience was a path to wholeness, and that we needn't be afraid of our craziness, that we can go into craziness, to use that pejorative word, but that we can allow deep experience and not be afraid of it. And Grof then, last thing I'll say is that Grof then identified in his work with LSD 3 main death rebirth experiences, all of which were terrifying in their experience, but it's the willingness to go through it that allows you to be reborn, so to speak.
There are an awful lot of people who have been reinventing our own earth-based spirituality. It's not that hard. Human beings have been doing it since we've been on the planet, and we may have separated ourselves from each other and from our deep connections to the planet, but we can get them back. We can go back, and as I mentioned earlier, the circle will bring us together. It really does start with a circle, getting together and holding hands in a circle, breathing together, chanting together, acknowledging the space that we're in, acknowledging the gifts that the planet has given us, and then moving from there. Listen to the earth around you. Listen to the air, to the trees, to the animals, whatever, and listen to your own heart and take it from there.
Yeah, nice. Looks like it's David and then Amanda after that.
Yeah, it's great discussion. The concept, or the concept of how do we work with Indigenous cultures is, I've been working with Indigenous cultures for 30 years throughout the Americas. And it is it's a brain squeezer. It's a real challenge. I respect what everybody's saying here about not stealing. We certainly don't want to steal, but at the same time, I have seen a lot of Indigenous cultures begging to give us technology that they have, because, I think if we look back in history, a lot of us are Indigenous. We're just not American Indigenous. And I think, being Russian steppe Indigenous, Mongolian, Middle Eastern Indigenous, Aryan, all those things are we've had this technology in the past. And unfortunately, we're the ones who we've replaced it with new technology that's doing so much damage along with some good. And a lot of these cultures that I see are begging us to please open to this old technology. So, I just encourage people, don't shut the door on that possibility, because we're all here together. We're all in this together. And the other thing that I've I've dealt with over the years is working with a lot of cultures that, whether it's because of us or because of just other things, have lost some of this technology themselves. And one of the things that I struggle with, and I had a conversation with somebody the other day who's a Siberian shaman, is how do we help to empower these people to empower themselves? And this is a very specific example. This friend has somebody living on her property who's a Huichol Indian and is trying to fix up the trailer that they live in. And the person came back from Mexico and was like, won't use the lights, won't use the refrigerator. And they're like, I don't understand. We're giving them this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but you're putting all these things in this person's life. And this person is so connected to the earth and to nature and to spirit. And you're putting in all this electricity and these things that become blockages. And they're not doing it in any way that's animistic. They're doing it with the best of intentions. And so in my own experience, what I've seen is, and it's a double-edged sword again, you have to help them to be empowered, whether it's giving them access to education. Many cultures I've seen won't go to doctors, don't trust until somebody in their own village comes back and is a doctor. And my point is, I just encourage people, don't limit us by only thinking of it as stealing. The ball's only so big that we're on, and we're all on it together.
I'm a white person who has no connection to my culture. I have no idea who my ancestors are. I've been talking about this a lot. I have this kind of spiritual counselor / therapist person that I've been seeing. They are an Indigenous person, and I pay for services with them. And I think there are different, sorry, I can't remember the name of the last person that talked, but I think there are lots of ways to have, to have these kind of interactions of different cultures without stealing. And one way that I do that is literally paying for my time with this person and hearing from them their perspectives on things. And it's actually, I think it's beneficial for both parties. I was actually, hopefully if we have time, I'm trying to find a link to, there's this one person that I've been following who has written a lot about exploring your own identity, especially as someone who is probably, there's so many people that have lost their identities through colonialism and through whiteness, and also just through race in general, putting people in categories of race. And I think something that I've learned from my spiritual counselor is just you don't need to know exactly where you come from or who your ancestors are to speak with them and to connect with them. So yeah, thank you.
Something that has been crossing my mind throughout this conversation, specifically on bringing in Indigenous knowledge, is being mindful of, again, there is a power dynamic, something that's been crossing my mind. For example, that we want to find out how do you use these medicines to heal, or how do you use these medicines in which way. And I really love the perspective that Leo's bringing, that, and John, with a lot of these things are just human. They're innate to us, and we can figure out our own ways of doing it intuitively. And we don't necessarily need to call upon others to do that. But I also appreciated, I think it was Bailey who was saying let's not shut down the conversation. There are ways that we can keep conversing and have a kind of interaction and exchange. I'm also wondering, on the bigger picture, if we're coming from a Western perspective, we are literally driving ourselves into a hole right now. We are about to lose our planet very shortly, very quickly. Yet we want to ask about well, how do we use psychedelics? How do we heal? But I think I always ask myself, to what degree am I going to adopt their worldview? To what degree am I going to Indigenous groups and saying I want to be a part of your society and let me learn in that way. I'm not saying that that's necessarily appropriate to do, but just hypothetically speaking. So yeah, that's kind of going back to my original question of how much work has already been done in creating that relationship in terms of specifically with psychedelics and Indigenous folks, or is it more of a hypothetical conversation that we're having? I think we're all aware that we really, because there are experts in the rooms that have been here a lot longer and I've been using these things. I feel that's what you're getting at, Ronan, is we've been in this game for a very short period of time, so let's look to Indigenous groups since they've been here for a minute. So I'm wondering, do we know that answer? Do we know how many relationships have been built and who's doing that work already?
Yeah, I feel a little refreshed. I've often wondered, over the last decades, since the 60s, I've wondered about this whole subject of our culture and Indigenous cultures. And it's a complicated subject, obviously, but I'm refreshed by what I've heard from Courtney and Leo and John and David, and maybe a few others, that point to the fact, point to to an aspect that may be happening, which is that to remind us, I guess, to look into ourselves, and that our conversation this evening and our involvement with everything that each of us is involved with, comes from some kind of internal longing and looking outside. Not that we can't make relationship with anybody, but there's an externalization, I think, that is a danger with labeling Indigenous cultures and then building an artificial relationship between them and us, so to speak. And as I think people have been saying, we are all human. We are all Indigenous on the planet, as David was suggesting. And to remember that, to not, if we only see ourselves as white Westerners, me being white, or label ourselves in any other way, then I think we're doing a disservice not only to ourselves, but to the other groups that we're separating from. And that there's something about what may be happening on the planet, or that I like to believe might be happening on the planet as we've evolved, as we are in the process of evolving, from 300,000 years ago. We're in that process now. We're participating in that process. And it's got to be a human one, fundamentally. So, and we know that the psychedelic experience gets us in touch with that. But then we can forget it and start to them and us so easily. And I think that's a super danger with our conversations about Indigenous cultures.
It's kind of what I was feeling, and I'm feeling very disconnected right now. We're talking about the science and the science and the silence, and then all of a sudden we're talking about Indigenous. And for one thing, the two don't connect for me when we talk about science and we talk about spiritualism. A lot of what I'm hearing is romanticizing that, oh, we accept the Indigenous. To me, it just sounds very white, very Western, and we're trying to convince ourselves that we are connected when we're not. We've romanticized what we think Indigenous culture is because we don't have a reference for it, because we're so different. I think David, he was talking about how these people he know were trying to give a refrigerator and electricity, and we're trying to force our white Westernism on somebody else instead of listening to what it is that they want. So I'm just feeling very disconnected, very disappointed with the romanticization of what we think and how we romanticize how we're respecting Indigenous culture. And you can't come to it from a science perspective. I think it has to come from a spiritual and understanding, like you convert to Catholicism, you can convert to Judaism. And it's like, it takes years of study to understand what it means, what the medicines mean from a spiritual perspective. And you can't romanticize it in a conversation because it makes no sense to me.
So I just had a thought as we're having this discussion about, appropriating Indigenous stuff and is it theirs, is it ours, and respecting different cultures and things like that. So I propose a question, which is, if there was some sort of a global pandemic and the white scientific community created a vaccination that could save people, should we share it or not share it with them? I'm not giving an answer. I'm just saying, let's look at it from a different perspective. If there is a
I don't know, like everybody has their own ideas of what is best, both for themselves, both for their communities, both for other communities. It's so individualized and so specific to people, to communities, that I don't think anybody has the answer, legitimately. I don't. So every single, problem that everybody has, every conflict that every group has, it's just good to try to do your best and try to learn as much as possible and just to listen as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, I think that what I was trying to get at with being careful, we shouldn't neglect the fact that we're all human. We are human, right? I think we're living in an amazing moment right now to kind of acknowledge the vastness of experience. Like, life is so indescribably creative and different and unique in so many different ways, right? Sometimes so fundamentally, like we can do psychedelics and say like, wow, how crazy was that? But then you can even just talk to a person, right? And be like, I don't even know how to imagine the life that you're living. And I kind of think similarly with like Indigenous groups, like they're not monolithic, first of all. So it's like, we can't even say like, oh, Indigenous groups, they can tell us. It's like each group might see it differently. Each individual might see it differently. There might be different ways of communicating it. The language that's used, like I might not be able to comprehend nor communicate like my own experiences, right? So I guess that's what I meant by like being a little bit weary about the we are human part. It's like, I think the difference is the beauty right now. Like if it's not saying that there is no difference between our groups. It's like there's so many differences on collective and individual levels. And by celebrating the differences and finding the value creativity behind it, that will fuel our creativity collectively to make different solutions and potentially hold different cultures where it's not just, oh, Western culture, Indigenous culture, and these kind of like binaries or separations, but now we need to create a whole different collective that's not just human, but based on relationship and our own creative. Like there's no prescribed identity for us to all abide by. We have to figure out the love we have for each other and like the reason we want to be here together and relate, whether it be closely or from a distance or whatever that might look like. But Plague Tale, I wanted to respond to that question about the vaccination too. Like, I think that's a beautiful example, right? Like, I think, yes, offer it. And now we have all these conflicts that came out of like, it's like, we're trying to be helpful. Like the scientific community creating a vaccine, it's like, we are trying to save lives. And it's not just the like white scientists. There are so many people that have created this vaccine. But by offering it, now because there's conflict, we can have conversations and we can build relationship, we can build trust. And it's only through the challenge that we can build anything together. So I think that's also another pro of like the psychedelic experience and like trying to get research behind it. There will be conflict, but I think it's through conflict that we can create something different.
Mary, you mentioned, ending these binaries. And I think so much of it is that we're caught up in this binary. And I think Western culture really wants things to be in an either or way, in a black or white way, instead of this spectrum. And I've really tried to cultivate for myself a sense of both and. We can have both this and that. We can have both science and inclusion of Indigenous knowledges and everything. And it's about looking at a much bigger and more inclusive world and getting rid of this binary spectrum. And that's why people are so freaked out, because it really threatens everything, right? Saying that we're all connected down here at the roots and all these systems are overlapping and that we're all one, when everyone else has been like, oh no, it's man and woman and black and white and up and down and rich and poor. And we're like, oh no, it's all a holy mess. Hallelujah.
Take care, everyone.